Tonight we're settling into a calm drift through one of the most humbling ideas we humans ever tried to grasp, the scale of the universe. Not as a number, not as a chart, but as a feeling you can lean into slowly. When we talk about the cosmos, it's easy to picture swirling galaxies and glowing stars scattered like distant lanterns. But the moment we ask where Earth fits into all of that, something soft and slightly dizzying happens in the mind. Our home becomes small, not in a frightening way, but in a way that nudges you toward an easier breath, like realizing you've been holding your shoulders too high all day and only just now let them relax. Before we wander outward, I'd love to know something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Not just the country or the city, but what it feels like around you. Are you curled under blankets, lights turned down low? Are you winding down after a long stretch of tasks and noise? Maybe you're listening with headphones while the rest of your home stays quiet, or maybe this is playing softly in the background as you close your eyes. However you're here, I'm glad you made it into this moment, and since we're about to explore distances that stretch farther than comfort would normally allow, feel free to let the weight of the day soften a bit. No need to hold on to any tension while the universe unfolds around you. If you find this kind of slow exploration soothing, or simply a peaceful break from everything else life might ask of you, I'd be grateful if you gave this a like or maybe subscribed. It helps this little sleepy community reach more people who might need a pause, a quiet breath, or just a space to drift for a while. But don't worry about that too much right now. You're here, and that's enough. When we begin to think about the scale of the universe, there's a strange mixture of comfort and uncertainty that arises. Not the dramatic sort, but the gentle kind. The kind that reminds you how much exists beyond commutes, emails, grocery lists, and everything else we pile into a day. We often say Earth is small, and compared to the whole cosmos, that's undeniably true. But the feeling of that smallness isn't about insignificance. It's more about perspective. The kind that sneaks up on you when you look at the sky too long on a clear night and realize those tiny points of light are impossibly far, yet somehow familiar. What makes the scale of the universe such a soothing subject for a sleepy evening is the slow way it unfolds. There's no rush in cosmic distances, no urgency in planetary motions. Everything out there moves on timescales that make our daily concerns look like quick ripples on a calm lake. Even the fastest stars and the brightest galaxies follow rhythms that stretch far beyond a lifetime, and there's something strangely calming about that. A reminder that the universe isn't demanding anything from you. It simply exists, quietly, steadily, with no expectation that you keep up with its pace. Earth sits in the middle of all this as a small round speck carrying oceans, mountains, forests, cities, and billions of people who each have their own private timeline of memories and hopes. When we talk about how small our planet truly is, it's not meant as a diminishment. It's more like noticing how a single candle glows in a wide room. The glow doesn't shrink just because the room is large. If anything, the contrast makes it easier to appreciate the warmth of the flame. Earth is like that. A bright patch of life in a cosmos mostly quiet and cold. That contrast doesn't make us feel lost. It makes everything familiar feel more precious. Before we drift too far outward, it helps to settle into the simplest starting point, the view from where you are. Maybe you're inside, surrounded by textures and objects that make up your personal world. Maybe you're near a window where night has already arrived, or perhaps the sun is still lingering depending on your corner of the globe. Wherever you are, the distance from you to the nearest tree or building or streetlight is tiny compared to the vastness we're about to explore. Yet it feels real, close, immediate. Our senses are built for short ranges. We understand rooms. We understand cities. We can imagine continents. But the cosmos stretches so far beyond our built-in sense of scale that we need to shift gently into a different kind of awareness to even begin to picture it. As we start moving outward, it's worth remembering that Earth is the only place we know of where someone can sit comfortably and think about the universe at all. The only place where air fills lungs, where water flows across the ground, where warmth and light collaborate to support the entire story of life. That makes Earth feel larger in a way, as if its importance expands even as its physical size shrinks in comparison to everything else. A small home can still hold a whole life. A small world can still hold countless stories, connections, and moments that give meaning to the space inside it. Thinking about size on this scale brings up a simple question. How do we even measure something so large when our minds are anchored to the everyday? It's one thing to picture a mountain or an ocean, but entirely another to imagine the gap between planets or the emptiness surrounding stars. The numbers are so big they slip through the mind before we even have a chance to grasp them. That's why we ease into them slowly, step by step, without forcing the mind to stretch too far at once. The universe is patient. There's no need to rush. When astronomers talk about distances, they often use light itself as the ruler. Not because it's familiar, but because it's constant. Light moves steadily, without pause, covering enormous stretches of space in a way that feels almost effortless. Even then, we rely on simplifications because the actual scale is too big to hold all at once. But tonight, we're not racing toward numbers or calculations. We're drifting through the feeling of scale, letting the immensity of the cosmos wash over us in a slow, steady flow. It's almost funny to think that when you step outside on a clear night and look up, the universe appears incredibly close. The stars seem pinned just beyond reach, as if a short climb might get you there. But in reality, every single point of light is staggeringly far away, so far that even the nearest star beyond the sun is separated from us by a distance so immense it takes light more than 4 years to cross it. And that's just the beginning. That's barely outside our cosmic driveway. The true scale of the universe isn't something you grasp all at once. It's something you ease into, like walking slowly from a small room into a field that stretches farther than the eye can see. First, you notice what's near, then you begin to sense what's a little beyond that. Eventually, the horizon expands so far in your imagination that you realize the field never truly ends. It just keeps going, patiently, quietly. And as we settle into this gentle exploration together, the goal isn't to overwhelm the mind, but to let it stretch just enough to feel the awe without the strain. Earth will seem smaller the farther we go, but not in a way that makes it feel unimportant. More in a way that highlights how remarkable it is that life appeared on this little sphere in the first place. A warm oasis tucked into the emptiness, holding everything familiar within a thin shell of air and clouds. You don't need to hold the whole universe in your thoughts at once. You just need to follow the slow widening of perspective. Bit by bit, the distances will make sense in their own calm way. The stars will feel farther, the galaxies will drift into view, and Earth will settle gently into its place as a small but extraordinary home, floating in an expanse that doesn't rush, doesn't demand, and doesn't end abruptly. It continues quietly beyond anything we can touch. So as we ease forward, imagine the simplest picture. You, somewhere on this round blue world, listening to a soft voice describing a universe too large to measure in any ordinary way. And as that picture settles, allow the edges of your daily world to loosen a little. The universe is spacious. When we begin to picture where we live in the universe, it helps to start with the most familiar view, the one we rarely stop to appreciate because it's always beneath our feet or above our heads. Earth feels enormous when we're moving through our daily routines. Traveling even a single country can take hours. Flying across an ocean can take most of a day. Climbing a mountain, crossing a desert, or sailing across a sea can make the planet seem too large to ever fully grasp. And yet, the moment we try to understand the universe around us, this same world becomes something much smaller, almost delicate in scale. Not fragile in a fearful way, but contained. A place with boundaries that feel comforting when we notice them closely. Most of us rarely think about Earth's size beyond the rough image of a globe in a classroom or a map spread across a desk. Those flattened maps distort almost everything, stretching continents where they shouldn't be stretched, shrinking others until they appear far less significant than they truly are. But if you imagine Earth as it actually is, a round world suspended in a dark expanse, the picture becomes more honest. You can picture the oceans covering most of its surface, the continents resting like islands in a much larger sea, and the atmosphere wrapped around it like a thin protective layer that holds warmth, air, clouds, and weather in place. It becomes easier to picture Earth not as the center of anything, but as a place floating gently within a much larger environment. When astronauts describe seeing Earth from space for the first time, they often mention how surprising it is to realize how small the planet looks from even a short distance above it. They talk about seeing no borders, no lines between nations, no sense of human division, just one continuous sphere. and they describe the thinness of the atmosphere in a way that catches people off guard. From the ground, the sky seems endless. From orbit, it looks like a narrow band of blue pressed tightly against the curve of the planet. In some ways, the more distance you have, the more interconnected everything becomes. The sky that looks boundless from the ground becomes something you could almost pinch between your fingers if you were looking at it through a spacecraft window. The view from space gives us a useful starting point, not because everyone can experience it, but because it reveals something our daily lives keep hidden. Earth isn't as wide as it feels when we're inside it. The scale we experience while standing on the surface is entirely different from the scale seen from above. When we're walking down a street, 1,000 meters feels like a distance. When we're looking at a globe, 1,000 kilometers barely makes a mark. And when we take a step back into the larger cosmic picture, the entire planet becomes something that could fit comfortably beneath a fingertip on an imaginary map of the universe. Still, even when we understand that Earth is small compared to the larger cosmos, the size of our home is not meaningless. The distance around Earth at the equator is about 40,000 kilometers, which means if you could somehow walk without resting or slowing, and if you could step across oceans as easily as sidewalks, it would take months to complete a single loop. And yet light, the fastest thing we know, can travel around Earth more than 7 times in 1 second. When you think about it that way, the planet starts to feel small in a way that's both surprising and strangely grounding. We live on a world that's vast enough to hold every environment we know, yet compact enough for light to wrap around it repeatedly before a clock ticks once. This shift in perspective is where the journey outward begins. You might picture yourself standing somewhere familiar, maybe on a quiet street or near a window, where the day has already begun to soften. You imagine rising gently upward. At first, everything looks the same. You can see rooftops, trees, roads, perhaps the faint glow of lights turning on for the evening. A bit higher and you start to see patterns. A river that curves through a city. A coastline that outlines the edge of a country. The shapes become clearer even as the small details fade. Rise higher still, and something interesting happens. People, cars, buildings, everything that feels busy and urgent from the ground turns quiet and still. Not because it stops existing, but because the scale you're viewing it from has pulled you farther away from those details. Eventually, if you keep imagining yourself drifting upward, the land masses begin to show their full outlines. Continents come into view. Oceans take shape as vast stretches of blue. White clouds swirl across the atmosphere in slow patterns that unfold gradually. And before long, you begin seeing the world the way astronauts describe it. A sphere with soft blues, greens and browns, turning steadily beneath a thin layer of air. It's only at this height that the phrase tiny blue shore makes sense. Earth is not just a planet. It is a shoreline at the edge of a larger sea. The sea in this case is the universe itself, stretching endlessly in every direction. Thinking about Earth from this vantage point adds a quiet calm to the mind. The speed at which life moves on the surface becomes less pressing. The noise of everyday tasks fades. The scale of the world shifts from overwhelming to manageable. Knowing that everything familiar is gathered together on this small, round place doesn't make life less meaningful. It simply puts it into a context that feels more spacious. When we move further outward in our thoughts, Earth begins to shrink visually. At first, it becomes a sphere that could fit in the palm of your hand. A bit farther, and it looks like a marble. Farther still, and it becomes a dot. At some distance, it becomes invisible altogether. But even when it disappears from view, it's still there. It's still holding all the complexity of life, all the stories, all the individuals experiencing their own quiet evenings or early mornings. The fact that Earth can become invisible long before the universe ends says more about the scale of the cosmos than anything else. Our home is not small because it's insignificant. It's small because the universe is overwhelmingly large. Yet the view from our tiny shore is where everything begins. Every observation, every measurement, every imaginative stretch toward the stars starts here. This round planet provides the only window we have into the rest of the cosmos. Every image we've captured of distant galaxies, every calculation of stellar distances, every interpretation of cosmic evolution, all of it has been done from this one location. That gives Earth a kind of anchoring presence that doesn't change even when we acknowledge its small physical size. If you picture explorers mapping a vast ocean, Their position on a single island doesn't diminish the value of the work they do. The island becomes the starting point for the journey. Earth works the same way. Something else becomes clear the more you think about this. The universe is so enormous, so stretched beyond anything familiar, that the human mind can't hold it all in focus at once. But Earth, being small by comparison, is something we can grasp. And that grasp is what allows us to reach outward, slowly, carefully, until the boundaries we thought were limiting begin to expand in gentle steps. The view from our little shore becomes the perspective from which we can understand everything beyond it. Even as we think about Earth shrinking in size the farther we imagine ourselves drifting outward, there's an interesting shift that takes place. The meaning of the world doesn't shrink with it. The farther we step back, the more we see how much is contained in that single small sphere. Not just landscapes and oceans, but entire histories, cultures, languages, families, and all the quiet moments lived by individuals. A planet can be physically small while emotionally vast, and that contrast is part of what makes the journey outward so intriguing. We're not just measuring distances, we're measuring perspective. You might picture Earth again now in your mind, a round world with continents resting like shapes you could trace with a fingertip, clouds drifting lazily over oceans, and a thin blue line of atmosphere marking the boundary between air and space. That line holds everything we breathe. Without it, the world would be silent. But because it exists, the planet carries voices, wind, weather, and life itself. It may be small compared to what surrounds it, but it is complete. The smallest shell can hold a full world inside it when seen from the right angle. The more we look at Earth from this imagined vantage point, the more it becomes clear that our tiny shore is not defined by what it lacks, but by what it contains. And as we ease our way outward from this point, the scale around us will grow so rapidly that we'll need this anchor to keep everything grounded. The universe won't get smaller as we explore it. Our understanding will simply adjust in ways that make the distances feel less intimidating. When we begin comparing Earth to things beyond it, a curious shift happens almost immediately. The planet that feels impossibly wide when we're trying to cross a continent or fly from one hemisphere to another begins to seem compact once we place it beside the objects orbiting near us. But before we rush into comparing its size to the Sun or the other planets, it helps to understand Earth in terms that don't rely solely on distance or measurement. We live here. Everything familiar fits onto this single sphere. That gives the world a kind of emotional scale we rarely acknowledge. We feel its size not through numbers but through experience. Think about how big Earth feels when you're driving for hours and the road keeps going. The landscape changes slowly. Towns appear and disappear. The terrain shifts in ways that make the world feel almost endless. A single day of travel barely touches a fraction of the planet. Even a long flight often reveals that there's still so much more you haven't reached. From that perspective, Earth seems enormous, and for most of human history it was. Generations lived and died without ever travelling more than a small portion of it. Entire civilizations rose and fell without knowing what lay beyond distant oceans. But the moment we look at Earth, not as a collection of journeys or experiences, but as an object in space, its size takes on a very different meaning. The planet is about 12,142 kilometers across. A number like that is more than most of us can picture comfortably. To put it in perspective, if you could shrink Earth down to the size of a basketball, an airplane flying just above its surface would be thinner than a sheet of paper. That's how thin the atmosphere is compared to the size of the planet. The tallest mountains become tiny bumps. The deepest trenches turn into faint scratches. Everything that feels vast and towering in our daily lives becomes something you might miss if you didn't look carefully. Yet describing Earth this way doesn't quite capture the feeling of it. Because while the planet is physically small compared to the universe, the way we experience it gives it emotional weight. Earth is where every memory you've ever had has taken place, whether you were aware of the sky or not. The streets, rooms, parks, schools, workplaces, forests, and coastlines you've known all sit on this planet's surface. Your ideas, fears, hopes, frustrations, routines, and the quiet moments you never told anyone about all unfolded on this single world. That sense of familiarity makes Earth feel substantial, even though its actual size is modest when viewed from a cosmic perspective. A useful way to understand this contrast is to imagine standing at the ocean's edge. When the water stretches out to the horizon, it can feel nearly infinite. You know it isn't, but your senses tell a different story. The horizon hides everything beyond it. You can't see where the ocean ends or where another continent begins. The world feels enormous because your view is limited. Our perception of Earth's size works the same way. We experience it through fragments, small pieces that trickle into our senses moment by moment. We rarely see the whole, so we fill the missing pieces with assumptions about vastness. Now imagine stepping back, not physically but mentally, until you picture the entire planet. You see the oceans covering most of the surface. You see the continents laid out in shapes you could trace with a finger. And you notice how the world fits comfortably inside your mind's eye, a clear and complete image. The emotional scale of the world shifts slightly. What once felt overwhelmingly large becomes something you can hold as a single idea. That shift isn't about numbers, it's about perspective. To understand Earth's size more clearly, imagine trying to drive around its entire circumference. If you travel by car at highway speed without ever stopping, switching drivers every few hours like some determined relay team, the trip would still take days. But light, which moves faster than anything else known, circles the Earth more than 7 times every second. In the time it takes for you to blink, light has already completed multiple laps. That difference in speed is one of the first hints that Earth is not as large as it feels while we live on it. The planet's width becomes something that even a beam of light can cross effortlessly in an instant. The idea becomes even more striking when we compare Earth to the Sun, but we're not quite ready for that step yet. Before moving outward, it's worth lingering a little longer on the emotional and perceptual size of the world. When you stand in a crowded city, the tall buildings, busy streets, and dense surroundings make the world seem compressed. Everything feels immediate and close. But when you stand in an open field or at the edge of a quiet lake, the spaciousness around you gives your mind room to expand. Earth's perceived size shifts depending on context. Our senses don't measure kilometers, they measure experience. If you've ever looked at a world map and felt strangely small, that feeling comes from seeing continents arranged in a way that reveals their true relationships. North America sits beside the Atlantic, which touches the edges of Europe and Africa, which connect to Asia, which leads to the Pacific, which loops back to North America. The world becomes a continuous loop rather than a collection of separate regions, and once you see it that way, it becomes easier to imagine Earth not as an endless sprawl, but as a single connected place. Despite this, we often forget that the surface of Earth is thin. If the planet were an apple, the atmosphere would be thinner than its skin. The crust where we live would be even thinner than that. The entire biosphere, the layer where all life exists, is like a faint smear on the surface. Everything we know, everything that breathes, grows, eats, sleeps and thinks exists within a narrow band that barely extends into the planet or the sky. That thinness adds another layer to the idea of Earth's size. It's not a deep world, but a broad one. Life spreads out across it, filling the surface with movement and meaning. Thinking about Earth this way also reveals a subtle truth. The world feels large to us because we move so slowly compared to the distances involved. Walking, driving, even flying, all are slow on a planetary scale. If humans could suddenly move at a significant fraction of the speed of light, Earth would feel no larger than a neighborhood. The fact that it takes time to travel across continents is what gives the world its sense of size. The slowness of our movement stretches the planet in our perception, giving it depth it doesn't physically possess. Another way to look at Earth's size is to consider just how much of it we personally experience. A single human life occupies only a tiny fraction of the planet's surface. Most people never travel more than a handful of countries. Even those who spend their lives exploring still cover only a small portion of the globe. The world is filled with landscapes we will never walk across, forests we will never see, mountains we will never climb, and oceans we will never cross. This limited exposure makes Earth feel constantly new. There is always more of it than we personally encounter, but the moment we step outside the boundary of personal experience and view Earth factually rather than emotionally, the planet becomes compact. Astronomers sometimes say that if Earth were the size of a standard classroom globe, the Moon would be a small ball sitting several feet away. The Sun would be the size of a very large sphere placed more than 100 meters distant, and Earth itself would be a dot compared to other objects in the solar system. The world that holds everything familiar becomes something small enough to disappear quickly once you begin moving outward in scale. Yet despite the world's modest physical size, there is something uniquely comforting about its dimensions. Earth is large enough to contain endless variety, but small enough to be understood as a whole. It is a world where deserts, tundras, jungles, plains, cities, and oceans coexist in ways that feel natural once you see the planet as a complete sphere. The size allows for difference without disconnect. You can travel far enough to find environments completely unlike your own, but not so far that the world becomes disjointed. There's also a psychological aspect to Earth's size that people rarely consider. Because the world is round, you can travel in any direction and eventually return to the place you began. There are no edges, no ends. The finiteness of the planet provides a subtle sense of containment, which the universe as a whole does not. When thinking about the cosmos, the absence of edges can feel overwhelming. But Earth's boundaries offer a kind of mental safety. It's a finite place with defined limits, making it understandable even when the universe is not. All of this comes together to create a strange duality. Earth is small physically but enormous experientially. It is limited geographically but abundant emotionally. It is a tiny planet orbiting a medium-sized star in a galaxy full of billions of others, yet it feels expansive because we live inside its details. When you think about how small Earth truly is, you're not diminishing its significance. You're making room for a clearer understanding of everything that surrounds it. It can be surprising how much perspective shifts the moment we stop thinking only about Earth itself, and instead consider the space just beyond it. The world feels fairly self-contained while we live on its surface, but as soon as we look toward the moon, the scale of everything begins to stretch. The moon seems close when we see it rising over rooftops or hanging above a quiet road at night. Its surface looks almost touchable, as if a long ladder or a determined climb could take us there. But that impression dissolves once we learn how far away it actually sits. The distance is gentle in the sense that the moon is our nearest celestial neighbour, but it is also enormous compared to anything we move through in our daily lives. Most people have heard the number before. Roughly 384,000 kilometres separate Earth from the moon. Hearing it is one thing. Understanding it is something else entirely. When you look at the moon from the ground, it appears the size of a coin in the sky. The fact that something so small-looking is actually a world thousands of kilometres wide tells you immediately that your senses are not equipped to judge cosmic distances. The light from the moon makes it feel present, almost companion-like, but the empty space between us and that cratered world is vast enough that it took humans thousands of years just to imagine crossing it, and even longer to actually succeed. One way to feel the scale more clearly is to imagine Earth and the moon sitting on a table, reduced in size but keeping their proportions. If Earth were a basketball, the moon would be roughly the size of a lemon, and that lemon would sit several meters away. Not next to the basketball, not within easy reach, far enough that you'd instinctively take a few steps to close the distance. This simple model already reveals something important. For all appearances, Earth and the moon are not neighbours, in the sense that two houses on a street are neighbours. They are separated by a gap large enough to fit every other planet in the solar system between them, with space to spare. That alone shifts the way we think about Earth's place in its own little corner of the universe. The space between Earth and the moon is not empty in a dramatic or intimidating sense. It's simply open, quiet, and vast. No air, no weather, no sound, no wind. Just a gradual thinning of Earth's influence as distance increases. The atmosphere fades long before that halfway point, turning from breathable air to thinner layers, and eventually to nothing at all. Gravity weakens slowly but never vanishes. Light travels effortlessly across the gap, making the moon appear closer than it is. But for humans, that space remains enormous. Nothing in our everyday movement compares to it. A long drive, a cross-country flight, even a wide ocean crossing. None of these experiences prepare us to intuitively grasp what 384,000 kilometres means. This gap also reveals something subtle about Earth's size. The moon is much smaller than Earth, yet from a distance it commands attention. It is bright enough to cast shadows, steady enough in its orbit to guide ancient calendars, and close enough to influence tides across the planet. The fact that something so capable sits so far away highlights how small Earth becomes in spatial terms when we place it in cosmic context. The Moon's distance dwarfs any place on Earth. You could travel from one side of the world to the other dozens of times and still not cover the space between Earth and its companion. When astronauts traveled to the Moon, they described an experience that underscored just how wide the distance feels once you're making the journey. As their spacecraft drifted farther from Earth, the planet began to shrink. At first, it looked like a giant curved horizon through the window. Later, it became a round sphere suspended in blackness, and eventually it became something they could cover with a thumb held at arm's length. The world that had always felt undeniably large became suddenly small. Not insignificant, just contained. Seeing Earth from that distance changed the way many astronauts thought about home, borders, conflict, and the everyday rush that fills life on the surface. When a planet can be covered by a thumb, arguments and worries seem slightly less rooted than they once appeared. The Moon has a similar effect when viewed from Earth, even if we're not aware of it. It becomes a reference point for distance. We know it is far away, but still visibly present. That combination makes it a stepping stone in our mental journey outward. The Moon is not so far that it disappears from view, nor is it so close that it feels within easy reach. It occupies a middle ground, the first true landmark beyond Earth's surface. Once you consider it properly, the scale of the universe begins to open up in a steady, manageable way. The distance also matters because of what lies within it. There is no physical structure connecting Earth to the Moon, no bridge, no faint trail of matter, no tunnel. Just space. That emptiness might sound eerie, but in this context it becomes soothing. It suggests the universe doesn't rush, it doesn't crowd. It offers room for objects to coexist without colliding. Earth and the Moon orbit one another in a quiet cosmic dance across a space filled with nothing but the soft pull of gravity. That calmness is something we rarely associate with distance because, in human terms, long distances often come with effort, time, or strain. In space, distance simply exists. No struggle, no hurry. Just the quiet separation of celestial bodies. To get a better sense of the Moon's true scale relative to Earth, think again of the basketball and the lemon. The Moon is about 1/4 the width of Earth. That makes it large compared to many other moons in our solar system. In fact, relative to its planet, our Moon is unusually big. This gives Earth-Moon system a distinctive character. The Moon influences tides, stabilizes Earth's rotation, and affects the length of our days in ways that many people never think about. Without the Moon, Earth would wobble more chaotically. Seasons might shift unpredictably. Climate would be less stable. In that sense, the Moon is not just a distant sphere. It is part of Earth's identity, even if it sits far outside our immediate reach. But even knowing this, the distance remains difficult to feel intuitively. The Moon seems reachable when we see photographs of astronauts standing on its surface, because the human figures add familiarity. Their presence makes the landscape seem tangible. But consider how long it actually takes to get there. The Apollo spacecraft needed roughly 3 days to cross the gap. 3 days of drifting through blackness, with Earth shrinking behind and the Moon growing slowly in the window. Imagine looking out and seeing both objects, realizing that you've left one world but haven't yet arrived at another. That space in between, silent, enormous, empty, is unlike anything we experience naturally on Earth. It also helps to imagine the distance in terms of a familiar object like a car, even though a car cannot drive through space. If a vehicle could travel continuously at highway speed without stopping, it would take months to reach the Moon. Meanwhile, light makes the trip in just over a second. This difference again shows how slow human movement is compared to cosmic distances. The Moon is close in astronomical terms, but unimaginably far in human terms. The contrast is both humbling and oddly comforting. It reminds us that our sense of scale is rooted in our own limitations, not in the nature of the universe. Another aspect of the Earth-Moon relationship that reveals scale is the size of Earth's shadow. During a lunar eclipse, when Earth passes between the Sun and the Moon, the shadow cast by the planet covers the Moon completely. That shadow stretches across space in a cone that tapers but remains wide enough to engulf a world thousands of kilometers across. This demonstrates something easy to overlook. Earth, though small in the cosmic scheme, still carries weight and presence within its immediate surroundings. Its shadow reaches far enough to reveal the invisible relationships between celestial bodies. The Moon stays in orbit because Earth's gravity holds it close, even across great distance, and in turn, the Moon gently influences Earth's tides and rotation. The two bodies maintain a connection despite the gap between them. When we think about the Moon's distance, we often imagine it as an empty stretch of blackness, but in reality it represents a boundary between what humans have physically touched and what remains untouched. We have travelled beyond Earth only once to this nearby world. The space between them marks the limit of our steps so far, and because the distance is so large, the achievement feels monumental. The fact that humans once crossed that gap using limited technology from the mid-20th century adds even more awe to the scale. We built machines capable of pushing through hundreds of thousands of kilometers, landing on another world and returning safely. That accomplishment didn't shrink the distance. It simply showed that distance could be navigated with enough effort, patience, and careful design. Thinking about all this brings an interesting realization. The Moon is not far or close in the way we normally think about distance. It sits in a category of its own, a liminal space between the familiar and the cosmic. Close enough to observe in detail, far enough to challenge imagination. Present in our sky, absent from our reach. It is part of our world, but also separate from it. That balance makes it a perfect reference point as we move outward to understand the solar system more fully. Once you've spent a little time thinking about the space between Earth and the Moon, it becomes easier to imagine the wider region that surrounds both of them. The moment we step outward into the solar system, the scale begins to stretch in ways that are difficult to picture at first. Nothing in human experience prepares us for how spread out everything becomes. The planets float in orbits that seem orderly when drawn on a diagram, but in reality the distances between them are so large that even calling them neighbours feels slightly inaccurate. And yet, for all that space, the solar system has a calmness to it. Nothing drifts chaotically in and out. The planets move in predictable paths. The sun glows steadily. Everything seems unhurried, as though the neighbourhood has settled into a long, quiet routine. The sun, sitting at the centre, appears enormous to us when we think about it on its own. But the solar system is much larger than the star at its heart. If the sun were reduced to the size of a large sphere you could hold in both hands, Earth would shrink to the size of a small bead orbiting many meters away. The Moon would be a tiny speck circling that bead. And all the other planets would lie even farther out, with gaps so wide between them that you might hesitate before walking from one to the next, because the emptiness would feel like it goes on forever. This is the first thing people often misunderstand about the solar system. It is mostly distance. Space dominates far more than objects do. Those vast gaps create a sense of stillness that is hard to describe. When we think of a neighbourhood, we imagine houses situated close together. But in the solar system, every house is separated by huge stretches of nothing. If the planets were placed on a scale model along a long stretch of road, you could walk for minutes without seeing the next one. Even the inner planets, often described as the compact region near the Sun, sit far apart compared to any distance on Earth. And once you move outward toward the gas giants, the scale expands dramatically. Standing on Earth, looking up at the sky, it is natural to assume the solar system is filled with activity. The sun rises, the planets move, the moon cycles through phases, but almost all of this motion is slow, extremely slow. The planets take years to complete a single orbit. Jupiter circles the Sun roughly every 12 Earth years. Saturn needs nearly 30. And if you wander mentally out to the edges, to Neptune or beyond, the orbits grow so long that it becomes difficult to attach a human sense of time to them. Neptune takes more than 160 Earth years to complete one trip around the Sun. That means no one has lived long enough to witness a full Neptune year. This slow rhythm contributes to the neighbourhood's peaceful atmosphere. While Earth spins rapidly, and our lives move in quick cycles of days and nights, the solar system drifts almost lazily. If you were to imagine yourself floating above the Sun, watching the planets move, you wouldn't see them racing. They'd glide along their paths like boats on a lake with no wind. That kind of movement is soothing to picture because it reminds you that not everything in the universe operates on the same pace as human life. Out there, change is measured in decades, centuries, and millennia, not hours or minutes. The neighborhood has its own structure. Closest to the Sun lie Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars, the inner planets. They're relatively small, made mostly of rock and metal. When placed on a diagram, they appear clustered together. But even here, the distances between them would feel enormous if you tried to cross them physically. Mercury, for example, is tens of millions of kilometers away from Venus, and similar distances separate Venus from Earth and Earth from Mars. If you tried to travel between these planets using any technology we have today, the journey would take months, sometimes longer, depending on their positions in their orbits. Beyond Mars, the solar system suddenly opens into an immense gap known as the asteroid belt. Many people picture the asteroid belt as a crowded region where rocks bump into one another constantly. But the reality is very different. If you were drifting through it, you would likely not see a single large rock nearby. The objects are so spread out that you could travel for days without encountering anything of note. This area reveals once again how empty the solar system really is. Even the parts we imagine as cluttered are mostly open space. Continuing outward, the gas giants appear next. Jupiter, the largest planet in the neighborhood, dominates this region. If Earth were a small bead, Jupiter would be a sphere large enough to fill both your hands and then some. It contains more mass than all the other planets combined. And yet, despite its size, the distance between Jupiter and Saturn remains enormous. You could fit all the inner planets in the space between them and still have room left over. This pattern repeats again and again. Distance outnumbers substance. Saturn, with its rings, adds another layer to the scene. The rings look delicate, almost fragile when photographed, but they span a width greater than the distance between Earth and the Moon. Even then, the solar system's emptiness continues beyond them. Uranus and Neptune follow in orbit so far from the Sun that sunlight reaches them in a softened, faint way. It takes hours for the Sun's light to travel to Neptune. That detail alone hints at the vast size of the solar system. Light, which seems instantaneous on Earth, needs hours to cross the neighborhood. Something else becomes clear when thinking about these distances. Earth, despite being the world we know best, occupies a very small zone in this larger arrangement. It's just one world on one orbit among many. From a quiet cosmic viewpoint, Earth doesn't appear as the busy, complicated place we experience daily. It becomes a single object drifting along a track, far from its neighbors, separated by hundreds of millions of kilometers. And yet the solar system feels coherent. Everything orbits the same star. Everything follows a set of stable paths. There is structure without crowding. The feeling of peacefulness in this neighborhood comes not only from the slow movement, but from the predictability.